On Criticism. Essay by Schopenhauer. Arthur Schopenhauer. The following brief remarks on the critical faculty are chiefly intended to show that, for the most part, there is no such thing. It is a rara avis, almost as rare indeed as the phoenix, which appears only once in 500 years. When we speak of taste, an expression not chosen with any regard for it, we mean the discovery, or it may be only the recognition, of what is right aesthetically, apart from the guidance of any rule, and this either because no rule has as yet been extended to the matter in question, or else because, if existing, it is unknown to the artist or the critic, as the case may be. Instead of taste, we might use the expression aesthetic sense if this were not tautological. The perceptive critical taste is, so to speak, the female analog to the male quality of productive talent or genius. Not capable of begetting great work itself, it consists in a capacity of reception, that is to say, of recognizing as such what is right, fit, beautiful, or the reverse. In other words, of discriminating the good from the bad, of discovering and appreciating the one and condemning the other. In appreciating a genius, criticism should not deal with the errors in his productions or with the poorer of his works, and then proceed to rate him low. It should attend only to the qualities in which he most excels. For in the sphere of intellect, as in other spheres, weakness and perversity cleave so firmly to human nature that even the most brilliant mind is not wholly and at all times free from them. Hence the great errors to be found even in the works of the greatest men, or as Horace puts it, quandoque bonus dormitat homerus. That which distinguishes genius, and should be the standard for judging it, is the height to which it is able to soar when it is in the proper mood and finds a fitting occasion, a height always out of the reach of ordinary talent. And, in like manner, it is a very dangerous thing to compare two great men of the same class, for instance two great poets or musicians or philosophers or artists, because injustice to the one or the other, at least for the moment, can hardly be avoided. For in making a comparison of the kind, the critic looks to some particular merit of the one and at once discovers that it is absent in the other, who is thereby disparaged. And then if the process is reversed, and the critic begins with the latter and discovers his peculiar merit, which is quite of a different order from that presented by the former, with whom it may be looked for in vain, the result is that both of them suffer undue depreciation. There are critics who severally think that it rests with each one of them what shall be accounted good, and what bad. They all mistake their own toy trumpets for the trombones of fame. A drug does not affect its purpose if the dose is too large, and it is the same with censure and adverse criticism when it exceeds the measure of justice. The disastrous thing for intellectual merit is that it must wait for those to praise the good who have themselves produced nothing but what is bad. Nay, it is a primary misfortune that it has to receive its crown at the hands of the critical power of mankind, a quality of which most men possess only the weak and impotent semblance, so that the reality may be numbered amongst the rarest gifts of nature. Hence La Bruyère's remark is unhappily as true as it is neat. Après l'esprit de discernment, he says, si tu as au monde de plus rare, si sont les diamants et les pearls. The spirit of discernment, the critical faculty. It is these that are lacking. Men do not know how to distinguish the genuine from the false, the corn from the chaff, gold from copper, or to perceive the wide gulf that separates a genius from an ordinary man. Thus we have that bad state of things described in an old-fashioned verse, which gives it as the lot of the great ones here on earth to be recognized only when they are gone. Es ist nun das Geschick der großen Feier auf Erden. Erst wann sie nicht mehr sind, von uns erkannt zu werden. It is the fate of the great here on earth, to be recognized by us only when they are no more. When any genuine and excellent work makes its appearance, the chief difficulty in its way is the amount of bad work it finds already in possession of the field, and accepted as though it were good. And then if, after a long time, the newcomer really succeeds by a hard struggle, in vindicating his place for himself and winning reputation, he will soon encounter fresh difficulty from some affected, dull, awkward imitator, whom people drag in, with the object of calmly setting him up on the altar beside the genius, not seeing the difference and really thinking that here they have to do with another great man. This is what Iriart means by the first lines of his 28th fable, where he declares that the ignorant rabble always sets equal value on the good and the bad. Siempre acostumbra hacer el vulgo necio. De lo bueno y lo malo igual aprecio. The foolish crowd always tends to hold both the good and the bad in equal esteem. So even Shakespeare's dramas had, immediately after his death, to give place to those of Ben Jonson, Massinger, Beaumont and Fletcher, and to yield the supremacy for 100 years. So Kant's serious philosophy was crowded out by the nonsense of Fichte, Schelling, Jacobi, Hegel. And even in a sphere accessible to all, we have seen unworthy imitators quickly diverting public attention from the incomparable Walter Scott. For, say what you will, the public has no sense for excellence, and therefore no notion how very rare it is to find men really capable of doing anything great in poetry, philosophy, or art, or that their works are alone worthy of exclusive attention. The dabblers, whether in verse or in any other high sphere, should be every day unsparingly reminded that neither gods, nor men, nor booksellers have pardoned their mediocrity. Mediocribus esse potus. Non homines non concessora calumni. Neither men, nor gods, nor booksellers allow poets to be mediocre. Are they not the weeds that prevent the corn coming up so that they may cover all the ground themselves? And then there happens that which has been well and freshly described by the lamented Feuchtersleben, who died so young, how people cry out in their haste that nothing is being done, while all the while great work is quietly growing to maturity, and then, when it appears, it is not seen or heard in the clamor, but goes its way silently in modest grief. Yes erscheint none, niemand CDS, niemand hordies im Geskry, mit beskiedna trauer ZDS, still vorbi. It appears now, no one sees it, no one hears it in the clamor. With humble sorrow it passes, quietly by. This lamentable death of the critical faculty is not less obvious in the case of science, as is shown by the tenacious life of false and disproved theories. If they are once accepted, they may go on bidding defiance to truth for 50 or even 100 years and more, as stable as an iron pier in the midst of the waves. The Ptolemaic system was still held a century after Copernicus had promulgated his theory. Bacon, Descartes and Locke made their way extremely slowly and only after a long time, as the reader may see by D'Alembert's celebrated preface to the Encyclopedia. Newton was not more successful, and this is sufficiently proved by the bitterness and contempt with which Leibniz attacked his theory of gravitation in the controversy with Clarke. Although Newton lived for almost 40 years after the appearance of the Principia, his teaching was, when he died, only to some extent accepted in his own country, whilst outside England he counted scarcely 20 adherents, if we may believe the introductory note to Voltaire's exposition of his theory. It was, indeed, chiefly owing to this treatise of Voltaire's that the system became known in France nearly 20 years after Newton's death. Until then a firm, resolute, and patriotic stand was made by the Cartesian vortices, whilst only 40 years previously, this same Cartesian philosophy had been forbidden in the French schools. And now in turn D'Aguesseau, the Chancellor, refused Voltaire the imprimatur for his treatise on the Newtonian doctrine. On the other hand, in our day Newton's absurd theory of color still completely holds the field, 40 years after the publication of Goethe's. Hume, too, was disregarded up to his 50th year, though he began very early and wrote in a thoroughly popular style. And Kant, in spite of having written and talked all his life long, did not become a famous man until he was 60. Artists and poets have, to be sure, more chance than thinkers, because their public is at least 100 times as large. Still, what was thought of Beethoven and Mozart during their lives? What of Dante? What even of Shakespeare? If the latter's contemporaries had in any way recognized his worth, at least one good and accredited portrait of him would have come down to us from an age when the art of painting flourished, whereas we possess only some very doubtful pictures, a bad copper plate, and a still worse bust on his tomb. And in like manner, if he had been duly honored, specimens of his handwriting would have been preserved to us by the hundred, instead of being confined, as is the case, to the signatures to a few legal documents. The Portuguese are still proud of their only poet Camões. He lived, however, on alms collected every evening in the street by a black slave whom he had brought with him from the Indies. In time, no doubt, justice will be done everyone, tempo e gallant uomo, but it is as late and slow in arriving as in a court of law, and the secret condition of it is that the recipient shall be no longer alive. The precept of Jesus the son of Sirach is faithfully followed. Under should judge none blessed before his death. He, then, who has produced immortal works, must find comfort by applying to them the words of the Indian myth, that the minutes of life amongst the immortals seem like years of earthly existence, and so too that years upon earth are only as the minutes of the immortals. This lack of critical insight is also shown by the fact that, while in every century the excellent work of earlier time is held in honor, that of its own is misunderstood, and the attention which is its due is given to bad work, such as every decade carries with it only to be the sport of the next. That men are slow to recognize genuine merit when it appears in their own age, also proves that they do not understand or enjoy or really value the long-acknowledged works of genius, which they honor only on the score of authority. The crucial test is the fact that bad work, Fichte's philosophy for example, if it wins any reputation, also maintains it for 1 or 2 generations, and only when its public is very large does its fall follow sooner. Now, just as the sun cannot shed its light but to the eye that sees it, nor music sound but to the hearing ear, so the value of all masterly work in art and science is conditioned by the kinship and capacity of the mind to which it speaks. It is only such a mind as this that possesses the magic word to stir and call forth the spirits that lie hidden in great work. To the ordinary mind a masterpiece is a sealed cabinet of mystery, an unfamiliar musical instrument from which the player, however much he may flatter himself, can draw none but confused tones. How different a painting looks when seen in a good light, as compared with some dark corner. Just in the same way the impression made by a masterpiece varies with the capacity of the mind to understand it. A fine work, then, requires a mind sensitive to its beauty, a thoughtful work, a mind that can really think if it is to exist and live at all. But alas, it may happen only too often that he who gives a fine work to the world afterwards feels like a maker of fireworks, who displays with enthusiasm the wonders that have taken him so much time and trouble to prepare, and then learns that he has come to the wrong place, and that the fancied spectators were one and all inmates of an asylum for the blind. Still, even that is better than if his public had consisted entirely of men who made fireworks themselves. As in this case, if his display had been extraordinarily good, it might possibly have cost him his head. The source of all pleasure and delight is the feeling of kinship. Even with the sense of beauty, it is unquestionably our own species in the animal world, and then again our own race, that appears to us the fairest. So, too, in intercourse with others, every man shows a decided preference for those who resemble him, and a blockhead will find the society of another blockhead incomparably more pleasant than that of any number of great minds put together. Every man must necessarily take his chief pleasure in his own work, because it is the mirror of his own mind, the echo of his own thought, and next in order will come the work of people like him. That is to say, a dull, shallow and perverse man, a dealer in mere words, will give his sincere and hearty applause only to that which is dull, shallow, perverse or merely verbose. On the other hand, he will allow merit to the work of great minds only on the score of authority, in other words, because he is ashamed to speak his opinion, for in reality they give him no pleasure at all. They do not appeal to him, nay, they repel him, and he will not confess this even to himself. The works of genius cannot be fully enjoyed except by those who are themselves of the privileged order. The first recognition of them, however, when they exist without authority to support them, demands considerable superiority of mind. When the reader takes all this into consideration, he should be surprised, not that great work is so late in winning reputation, but that it wins it at all. And as a matter of fact, fame comes only by a slow and complex process. The stupid person is by degrees forced, and as it were, tamed, into recognizing the superiority of one who stands immediately above him. This one in his turn bows before someone else, and so it goes on until the weight of the votes gradually prevail over their number, and this is just the condition of all genuine, in other words, deserved fame. But until then, the greatest genius, even after he has passed his time of trial, stands like a king amidst a crowd of his own subjects, who do not know him by sight and therefore will not do his behests, unless, indeed, his chief ministers of state are in his train. For no subordinate official can be the direct recipient of the royal commands, as he knows only the signature of his immediate superior, and this is repeated all the way up into the highest ranks, where the undersecretary attests the minister's signature, and the minister that of the king. There are analogous stages to be passed before a genius can attain widespread fame. This is why his reputation most easily comes to a standstill at the very outset, because the highest authorities, of whom there can be but few, are most frequently not to be found. But the further down he goes in the scale, the more numerous are those who take the word from above, so that his fame is no more arrested. We must console ourselves for this state of things by reflecting that it is really fortunate that the greater number of men do not form a judgment on their own responsibility, but merely take it on authority. For what sort of criticism should we have on Plato and Kant, Homer, Shakespeare and Goethe, if every man were to form his opinion by what he really has and enjoys of these writers, instead of being forced by authority to speak of them in a fit and proper way, however little he may really feel what he says? Unless something of this kind took place, it would be impossible for true merit in any high sphere to attain fame at all. At the same time, it is also fortunate that every man has just so much critical power of his own as is necessary for recognizing the superiority of those who are placed immediately over him, and for following their lead. This means that the many come in the end to submit to the authority of the few, and there results that hierarchy of critical judgments on which is based the possibility of a steady and eventually wide-reaching fame. The lowest class in the community is quite impervious to the merits of a great genius, and for these people there is nothing left but the monument raised to him, which, by the impression it produces on their senses, awakes in them a dim idea of the man's greatness. Literary journals should be a dam against the unconscionable scribbling of the age, and the ever-increasing deluge of bad and useless books. Their judgments should be uncorrupted, just and rigorous, and every piece of bad work done by an incapable person, every device by which the empty head tries to come to the assistance of the empty purse, that is to say, about 9/10 of all existing books, should be mercilessly scourged. Literary journals would then perform their duty, which is to keep down the craving for writing and put a check upon the deception of the public, instead of furthering these evils by a miserable toleration, which plays into the hands of author and publisher, and robs the reader of his time and his money. If there were such a paper as every bad writer, every brainless compiler, every plagiarist from others' books, every hollow and incapable place-hunter, every sham philosopher, every vain and languishing poetaster, would shudder at the prospect of the pillory in which his bad work would inevitably have to stand soon after publication. This would paralyze his twitching fingers, to the true welfare of literature, in which what is bad is not only useless but positively pernicious. Now, most books are bad and ought to have remained unwritten. Consequently, praise should be as rare as is now the case with blame, which is withheld under the influence of personal considerations, coupled with the maxim exitus socius, laudes laudaris ut absens. It is quite wrong to try to introduce into literature the same toleration as must necessarily prevail in society towards those stupid, brainless people who everywhere swarm in it. In literature such people are impudent intruders, and to disparage the bad is here duty towards the good, for he who thinks nothing bad will think nothing good either. Politeness, which has its source in social relations, is in literature an alien and often injurious element, because it exacts that bad work shall be called good. In this way the very aim of science and art is directly frustrated. The ideal journal could, to be sure, be written only by people who joined incorruptible honesty with rare knowledge and still rarer power of judgment, so that perhaps there could, at the very most, be one, and even hardly one, in the whole country. But there it would stand like a just aeropagus, every member of which would have to be elected by all the others. Under the system that prevails at present, literary journals are carried on by a clique, and secretly perhaps also by booksellers for the good of the trade, and they are often nothing but coalitions of bad heads to prevent the good ones succeeding. As Goethe once remarked to me, nowhere is there so much dishonesty as in literature. But, above all, anonymity, that shield of all literary rascality, would have to disappear. It was introduced under the pretext of protecting the honest critic, who warned the public against the resentment of the author and his friends. But where there is one case of this sort, there will be 100 where it merely serves to take all responsibility from the man who cannot stand by what he has said, or possibly to conceal the shame of one who has been cowardly and base enough to recommend a book to the public for the purpose of putting money into his own pocket. Often enough it is only a cloak for covering the obscurity, incompetence and insignificance of the critic. It is incredible what impudence these fellows will show, and what literary trickery they will venture to commit, as soon as they know they are safe under the shadow of anonymity. Let me recommend a general anti-criticism, a universal medicine or panacea, to put a stop to all anonymous reviewing, whether it praises the bad or blames the good. Rascal. Your name. For a man to wrap himself up and draw his hat over his face, and then fall upon people who are walking about without any disguise, this is not the part of a gentleman, it is the part of a scoundrel and a knave. An anonymous review has no more authority than an anonymous letter, and one should be received with the same mistrust as the other. Or shall we take the name of the man who consents to preside over what is, in the strict sense of the word, un societe anonyme as a guarantee for the veracity of his colleagues? Even Rousseau, in the preface to the Nouvelle Heloise, declares tout honnête homme doit avoir les livres tués public, which in plain language means that every honorable man ought to sign his articles, and that no one is honorable who does not do so. How much truer this is of polemical writing, which is the general character of reviews. Riemer was quite right in the opinion he gives in his reminiscences of Goethe. An overt enemy, he says, an enemy who meets you face to face, is an honorable man who will treat you fairly, and with whom you can come to terms and be reconciled. But an enemy who conceals himself is a base, cowardly scoundrel, who has not courage enough to avow his own judgment. It is not his opinion that he cares about, but only the secret pleasures of wreaking his anger without being found out or punished. This will also have been Goethe's opinion, as he was generally the source from which Riemer drew his observations. And indeed Rousseau's maxim applies to every line that is printed. Would a man in a mask ever be allowed to harangue a mob or speak in any assembly, and that, too, when he was going to attack others and overwhelm them with abuse? Anonymity is the refuge for all literary and journalistic rascality. It is a practice which must be completely stopped. Every article, even in a newspaper, should be accompanied by the name of its author, and the editor should be made strictly responsible for the accuracy of the signature. The freedom of the press should be thus far restricted, so that when a man publicly proclaims through the far-sounding trumpet of the newspaper, he should be answerable for it, at any rate with his honor, if he has any, and if he has none, let his name neutralize the effect of his words. And since even the most insignificant person is known in his own circle, the result of such a measure would be to put an end to 2/3 of the newspaper lies, and to restrain the audacity of many a poisonous tongue.